Hello, my name is Tamar Frydman, and on behalf of Jewish Funders Network, I'm happy to welcome you to today's briefing on poverty and the impact of COVID-19. This webinar is part of a series hosted by the National Affinity Group on Jewish Poverty. The National Affinity Group on Jewish Poverty is a collaborative of funders, Jewish federations, direct service providers, researchers, media outlets, and advocates dedicated to fighting poverty in the American Jewish community. During all of these briefings, we discussed the many challenges the coronavirus pandemic has created for Jews facing poverty and the agencies that serve them. We will hear the needs from the service providers on the ground supporting our front lines, share best practices and information, and strategize on ways to respond collectively. Today, we will focus on the intersection of philanthropy and government. I will now hand it over to our moderator for all of these conversations, Susan Ditkoff of the Bridgespan Group Boston, who will frame the conversation and introduce today's speakers. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Tamar, and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you. I think this is the 5th installment in our series. The first few focus on overall introductions to the COVID moment and the effect on poverty in the Jewish community and beyond. We've then had some webinars that focus specifically on different sectors, so food, housing, mental health, aging, and that sort of thing. Our last 2 webinars focus on systemic issues, and the last webinar in particular focused on the perspective of Jews of color, both as beneficiaries or clients who are disproportionately affected, as well as Jews of color who were leaders in our community and the effect that this has had on them, the disparate impact this has had on them. So today we're focusing on the role of philanthropy with respect to government. It's a little bit of an abstract topic, which can sometimes be welcome in this moment, where everything feels very sort of visceral and difficult. And a lot of the people who are watching these webinars and who we interact with every day are going through pretty difficult times right now, at best uncertain and ambiguous times, and at worst really complicated and difficult times economically, emotionally, in terms of their health. So we're trying to sort of balance a few different of those aspects, sort of mindful and of the real experience lived by the people that we're talking about and talking to, and also trying to look for some bright spots and some hopefulness and things that are working. So we're sort of mindful of balancing both of those right now. So today we're focused on, again, the role of philanthropy and government. It's a pretty wide target to aim at, but we are joined by 3 incredibly sophisticated and experienced leaders in our community. We will hear from 3 people. Louisa Chafee is the Senior Vice President of External Relations and Public Policy at the UJA Federation of New York. She brings nearly 2 decades of government leadership experience to that role, serving in the administration of Governor Cuomo as the Deputy Secretary for Human Services, with oversight over all of New York State Human Services and Veterans Affairs. And prior to that, spending more than a decade with the mayor's office in the city of New York, with Mayor Bloomberg, with extensive operational and policy responsibilities and some major, what I see as major infrastructure reforms in information technology. So delighted to have you with us, Louisa. We also have Ginna Green, who is who led Bend the Arc, which is of Jewish Action, and as the Chief Strategy Officer. She brings a wealth of experience from advocacy to electoral experience, communications, organizing, all bringing Jewish values and a Jewish voice to the fight for social justice. Previously, she had been the Managing Director of the Democracy Collaborative at Rethink Media, and again, led teams in a number of different organizations, all focused on communications, advocacy, and social justice. So we are delighted to have Ginna with us to bring all of your experiences. Jerry Rubin is the President and Chief Executive Officer of JVS Boston. Prior to that, he had been working in the general nonprofit community, working on workforce development and education policy and research with Jobs for the Future and a variety of other organizations. And he has extensive experience through JVS Boston and previously sort of at that intersection between the nonprofit world and government, especially in an organization like JVS, which really does focus pretty heavily on that intersection between what it is that government's responsibility is and what's theirs to do, and where the nonprofit innovation landscape and creativity needs to sort of supplement that and needs to make all of those interventions much stronger. So we're excited to have all three of you with us. I'll just say a couple of words at the outset, and then I will turn it over to Louisa to start, and then Ginna and Jerry. So just by way of content introduction, in the anti-poverty and human services field, unlike other fields in the Jewish world, like identity or camps or Jewish education, government does supply the vast majority of the programmatic dollars. Not that there aren't government dollars in some of the other areas, but it really is here the overwhelming expectation that government will focus on poverty issues. So this can lead to some myths out there by donors that philanthropy isn't needed and that poverty is government's job to deal with. But as we know, there are many gaps in what government provides across poverty-related fields: food security, employment and income security, housing security, and many more. And some of those gaps are indeed religious in nature in the sort of world of Jewish poverty. For example, a premium for kosher food, or for organizations that focus on the elderly in a Jewish capacity. But overwhelmingly, that's actually not where the biggest gaps are, which is a little bit of a misconception. Overwhelmingly, the drivers that focus on Jewish poverty really are the same as they are. Those gaps are the same as they are in the general nonprofit world. Government funds less than 100% of programmatic dollars. They're constrained. They're often inflexible, even despite the best efforts of any one individual in the system. Overwhelmingly, they can be quite inflexible, structurally inflexible about how dollars can be used. We have seen again and again sort of structural exclusion, systematic racism, and other issues with sort of really representing and including the communities that most rely on these services, and also should have a clearer voice and a more structural voice at the table when decisions are being made about their future. So there's plenty of room for philanthropy to do work to improve how anti-poverty work happens. And at its best, I'll just name a few. I mean, philanthropy can play a critically important role in many areas of leadership, advocacy, and movement building to create political will out there in the world for policy change or for needed changes. We're seeing that every day in the papers today. Outreach, direct engagement, authentic empowerment, as we said earlier, of people who've been historically marginalized and structurally excluded and disenfranchised. So bringing those people and those voices to the table. Legislative changes, judicial or legal changes, all kinds of research, R&D, all kinds of places where government really does not fund adequately, if at all, in the anti-poverty world. So with all of that, each of our guests has a slightly different, unique vantage point on this question. And so we really look forward to hearing from each of you. Louisa, both from your experience in the administration prior and now sort of on the other side of the table working with philanthropists and agencies, and sort of what you wish you had known, or what advice you would have had from your prior self to your current self, and vice versa, and what lessons you would hope that we can sort of take away specifically at this COVID moment. So Louisa, if we can start with you, I'd be grateful.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Tamar. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Louisa, and I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. As you said, I'm a New Yorker. I'm the Senior Vice President at UJA, so I've been in the philanthropic world now for 4 years. Prior to that, I was first in city and then in state government. And so I do sort of see both sides of this coin, although each administration is different, and also different chapters in different administrations are different. So I was in the Cuomo administration, obviously in a very different era than now, not just from COVID, but also as the focus was much more on economic development upstate, so a very different type of perspective. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that I do think philanthropy is absolutely critical in the space of fighting poverty, recognizing that government is the largest funder. But I think that philanthropy is critical in 3 separate ways, and different administrations tap into these ways in different, at different times. And I think part of our job from the philanthropic sector is also to think about how we can catalyze those connections. So to me, philanthropy, or from my experience, philanthropy can be the innovator. They can help fund pilot programs. They can help draw out new lessons. They could demonstrate sort of cutting edge or the need to pivot. So the innovation, I think, is really critical. Philanthropy can also be the partner to government. So they can actually, in programs together, figure out how to do certain portions of programs, or how to move forward certain aspects of programs that government, for either constraints on time or budget or procurement rules, can't change itself. So I think there are also lots of other examples from other parts of the country where that partnership, whether it be pure philanthropy or sometimes faith-based philanthropy, can really move lessons and drive different changes. And then the third part, and absolutely critical to organizations fighting poverty, but perhaps not as elegant or exciting, is that philanthropy also backfills government. So by that I mean that government often and unfortunately does not fully pay the costs of programs. They do not pay all aspects of programs. They do not recognize all communities needing programs. Sometimes government would like to serve communities, but cannot because of the nature of the services being provided or the population. So, you know, sometimes through no malice, there are still gaps, and sometimes it's simply inefficient government. So particularly unrestricted dollars in the philanthropic space can be absolutely critical to nonprofits to continue to remain stable as organizations, and thus take on the government dollars, serve at scale, and balance that sort of innovation from the private/philanthropic sector, government to serve at scale, and then also philanthropic to help make sure that, you know, the lights stay on, etc. So those are the sort of 3 categories I see. And I think you also, so as you said, Susan, I worked in the Bloomberg administration, very different administration than the de Blasio administration, but, you know, still the same city and the same challenges. And I think that part of the largest challenge from the philanthropic perspective is figuring out, how do you partner with your government? How do you help think about beyond dollars invested in nonprofit organizations and piloting, what can philanthropies themselves do? And so UJA really believes in advocacy. And I lead an advocacy team within a philanthropy, which is somewhat unusual. And we do a great deal of work, both within UJA, the grants we give with our agencies. We have about 45 nonprofits in New York City that are on the front lines of fighting poverty that UJA supports with unrestricted and targeted grants. And we also work really closely across the New York City anti-poverty community. So we have really strong partners in Catholic Charities and the Federation for Protestant Welfare Agencies, known as FPWA. Those are the sort of 2 other major faith-based pillars of social services. Each UJA is 2 weeks older than Catholic Charities. We often point out that we're over 100. FPWA is a little younger, but so we've been doing this for literally a century. And the point of that advocacy is that we bring together a strong values-rooted perspective, broad donor bases, thousands of clients, thousands of employees. And so often in advocacy, we can think about different perspectives to really help government consider the nature of the programs they are either moving forward or not moving forward, and the consequences thereof. And so those are sort of the places I see the intersections.
Great, thank you. That was a great way to start off. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Susan.
So let's keep going a little bit, and then we'll kind of get into a little bit more of a conversation. Ginna, you too, similar to Louisa, has had both experience in the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community from various camera angles. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, JFN, for convening this conversation, and Susan for your excellent facilitation in today's webinar, as well as the one a couple of weeks ago that I participated in. Really delighted to be back with y'all. This is such an interesting question, and I was really excited to see and hear Louisa just say how important advocacy is to the work of UJA, because from my perspective, that sort of the advocacy in favor of systemic change has been what has been foundational to my career in the progressive movement. And I would just say that I look at that policy change as really central to really alleviating poverty, because we know, you lifted this up, Susan, in your opening remarks, the relationship that systemic racism plays in poverty. And I think it's really important to, a couple things that I think I want to share before I sort of walk through the ways I think we make effective policy change. One is that the gaps in meeting human beings' basic needs, the lack of a complete safety net that mythically should be provided by the government but does not, is like, those gaps cannot be filled only by supplemental or piecemeal solutions. Like, actually filling the gap requires policy changes that would strengthen the very safety net that we are trying to fill. So it's really important for us to look at it from that perspective. And the other perspective that I'm holding in this conversation is that systemic problems can't be solved only by supplemental or piecemeal solutions, and they can't be solved equitably in an environment where inequity is at the core of those systems. So we are required to do a both and in this arena. We need most definitely those direct service providers who are on the ground, and we absolutely need those organizers and those advocates and those lobbyists and those foundations to put together an advocacy arm of this work to address the systemic change. And I think the way we do that is four main ways. One, policy change happens with pressure from the people, organizing, just looking and taking the policy implications out of just the poverty realm, thinking about Minneapolis and the changes that the city of Minneapolis has considered or is adopting as a result of just the last 6 weeks of increased pressure. Obviously, there are advocates on the ground in Minneapolis who've been doing this hard work for a long time, but they've managed to take advantage of a moment in a movement to really move that forward. So we've got pressure from the people. We've got strong advocacy in the halls of power, to Louisa's point, organizations and lobbyists and people who have relationships who are able to bring the lever of power from the people directly to the people who have the power. So that's important. There's organizations that we need to make sure are able to do that work day in and day out. We also need strong leadership. We need champions. We need to be able to elect people to office who hold the needs of our communities and our people first and foremost. So we need those folks in Congress, in state legislatures, in city councils to be making these decisions to actually affect people's everyday lives. So those are the people who actually have the power to harness the people's pressure and really take the recommendations of those advocates who know, here are policy recommendations for moving forward. And then we still need the grass tops influence. We still need folks who can make a call to their congressperson, who can make a call to their elected, who can put another bit of weight on the scale for folks who are making these decisions. So we've got power from the people in the streets, organizing, advocates who are in the halls of power, making amplifying those needs and really delivering the policy choices that we can move forward with. Leadership for those advocates to champion those ideas, and also leaders from outside of government and outside of the movement world to begin to actually put additional pressure on those folks. I think it's really important in that equation, looking at the role of philanthropy in particularly those first two buckets of organizing and pressure and power from the people, and advocacy that happens in the halls of power. those two pieces of work of organizing and advocacy have been key to my own career. And I will just say for me that organizations who understand, philanthropists who understand, foundations who understand and do this work and fund this work, understand the challenges and the needs of doing it. And what that means is the really smart ones recognize that this work cannot be contained in a single project or program bucket. I think within philanthropy, there's a trend, like an interest in a trend and almost a conventional wisdom around project or program-based funding. Actually, no. Give us the gen ops. Let us trust us with the ability to know when in a given moment we need to lean in on a particular policy issue or a particular project or a particular initiative. That nimbleness enables us to be more effective across all of the work that we're doing when we're not constrained by money being given to us in buckets along projects and people. I think in additional, let's talk a little bit about grant applications and reports. They're hard. One thing that I think about is that's your money that you have entrusted to us to deliver a result. Every 8 hours that I spend on a grant report or a grant proposal is 8 hours that I am not spending organizing. It's 8 hours that I'm not spending with a member of a congressional member's staff. It's 8 hours that I'm not spending training the trainer. So I think it's really important that we look at how we fund the work, not just what we fund, but how we fund it and what are the expectations that we have of our grantees and of the movement. And then finally, I would just say that in addition to the what and the how much and the who are the relationships and the trust. And when funders and foundations and philanthropists can actually operate in relationships with trust and deep understanding, then that just makes the work better. I think that the grantees are able to deliver, do more, feel supported in a way that ultimately makes our entire portfolio of work more effective. And I think it's really important for funders and for the movement and for advocates and for organizers to be able to be in relationship with each other and understand that it's a two-way street and that we're all in this to make life better for everyone.
Okay, I now have about 7 follow-up questions, but instead of asking them, I will invite everyone who is on the call to enter questions in the chat. I already see a couple have come in, so please keep those coming. We'll get to those after Jerry speaks. But Jerry, let me give you an opportunity to give us your perspective from not only the experience of a particular field or workforce development, but really a variety of different ways that you have engaged with government in the past and now and potentially going forward. So we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Susan. And I've already written down my own questions, so I'm adding to the long list. And it was really interesting to hear Ginna talk about advocacy around structural change, and we are involved in advocacy like that. I don't know that we'll have time to talk about the intersection of direct service and structural change advocacy. I think it's really fascinating. If we do have time, great. I'm actually not going to talk about that initially. I'm going to, because we are a direct service provider, and I think I can maybe shine a little bit of a light on that issue. What I do want to talk about relative to the intersection of philanthropy and government is what I sometimes think about as the philanthropic mythology of scale. Scale is a very important idea around in human services because the need is enormous and the delivery usually falls short of the need, and so it's the forever quest that we're after. But I think I find often in my career, and I've been in government, I've been in an organizing and advocacy role and in a direct service role. And what I have found often is philanthropy tells itself a myth about scale. So, the myth goes something like, well, we'll invest in innovation And then it's up to the grantee to figure out sustainability and scale. And in fact, you actually see that in the request for proposals where it says, well, tell me what your sustainability and scale strategy is. And I actually think people, when they write that, know that that's not intellectually honest, because in human services, for the most part, scale is actually impossible without significant public investment. And in most cases, at the federal and state level, that investment is and has been for some time in decline. I mean, in the workforce development field, for 50 years, the federal government has been disinvesting in workforce development services. This is nothing new. And while Massachusetts is actually pretty good on the scale of states that invest in workforce development, it's 3 to 6 zeros less than what federal investment looks like. And now that we're in fiscal crisis, we're going to lose a lot of the play. So if public investment is really a key to scale, and we know that scaling is difficult, then sustainability and scale is all our responsibilities. It's not the responsibility of the grantee, it's the responsibility of the community that's trying to create scale. So that said, I do believe there actually is a path to scale in direct services that philanthropy can be involved in and is involved in. There's lots of good stories. I'll tell one today. But I think there's 3 ways that I've thought about how philanthropy can be involved in scale in a responsible fashion, not in a dismissive fashion. And I'll mention those 3. And we've touched on some, my colleagues have touched on some of them. So first, which is where philanthropy loves to play and is very important, is investing in innovation and startups, so new ideas. And I wouldn't downplay this at all. This is a very important role, a role that often government does not play. It's really the venture capital in the not-for-profit sector. The second area where philanthropy can play and scale is then investing in actually scaling promising models, going from a tiny demonstration to actually see whether this programmatic intervention actually can deliver the goods and can do that in a way that proves out whether it's successful. And then the third piece, which I think is often neglected, is upon proven success, that philanthropy can then invest in public policy and advocacy that encourages public investment in proven models. And that piece often falls short. And I think it then sits on the grantee to figure out, well, what's the next philanthropic level of support that's going to continue to help me scale? Or how am I going to go from year to year to year to year to year? So I want to talk about a story that I actually think takes these 3 buckets of philanthropic intervention, and I think actually has a really good ending. So spoiler alert, it's a good ending, because I don't want to be cynical. I actually think there's a real opportunity here. We have been involved in Pay for Success or Pay for Performance project, the first actually in the country in the workforce development space. It's called the Massachusetts Pathways to Economic Advancement. It's a project that raised just over $13 million from 40 private investors, many of whom were from the philanthropic space and others were high net worth individuals and actually private investment companies. They invested in a fairly large scale model of providing services for English language learners to get better jobs. There's more detail to it, but that's enough detail. This was done with 2,000 individuals over 5 cities. So, for Massachusetts, workforce development, that's a pretty good scale. The repayment to the investors, which I'm happy to say is nearly done, they're almost all paid back with interest, was based on a market return that was based on earnings gains for the participants. So as people went through their learning and they got better jobs, they earned more. The administrative wage data, in other words, their W-2 forms, were being collected, and we actually looked at how much more they were earning. There was a random control trial, which showed that actually it was the intervention that made the difference. And then, as I said, investors got repaid. So what was the role of philanthropy? First, philanthropy invested in JVS and our financial partner, Social Finance, for 2 years of program design and development. Support that we just did not have the resources to spend 2 years before we got $1 for service delivery. Second, Philanthropy invested in the bonds themselves. So they actually bought the debt and then were repaid. They're getting their money back. So it's not philanthropy in the traditional sense. These are actually investments that then got paid back. But the third piece, which was really important, was that we had support to do the necessary advocacy. And we spent 2 years, actually 1 year into the project, we began the lobbying effort to get the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to adopt this new, proven, very effective model of adult education and employment and start operating this programmatic model and put it in the state budget. And I'm very happy to say last year we were successful. We got it in the state budget, and we now have a pay for performance contract for the next 3 years to continue this project. And the private investors are now out of the picture. So it was a very successful trifecta. Invest in R&D, invest in actually proving out the model, and then invest in making sure that it could stay for the long term. And then sustainability and scale isn't just my problem, but it's actually a problem that all of us have addressed. So I think this is a really important way to think about philanthropic involvement at this particular time. We know that public investment is at real risk. Massachusetts, like many other states, actually, we don't have a state budget. We're doing a monthly 1/12 budget. That's a first. And we'll see where we end up, but it ain't going to be pretty no matter what happens. And so scale is going to be at real risk, both here in the state level and at the federal level. And it strikes me that philanthropy has an opportunity to do two things. Double down on things that work, right? Spend less time on looking for the next bright, shiny object. Because in the workforce development field, there are at least a half a dozen proven models that have had random control trial demonstrated proof. We know what works. So invest in the things that work to get them to scale, and then invest in the public policy and advocacy that we need all the time, but we're really going to need over the next year because we're really up against it. So that would be how I would think about this kind of work.
This is terrific. And so I'm hearing sort of a few different themes. And one of them is sort of, Ginna, where you were, and Jerry, where you kind of got to, which is some of that intersectionality between some of the sort of what's happening on the ground and in the sort of the policy agenda, but also sort of how none of these sort of stands alone as an intervention, but they're kind of multifaceted. So I'm wondering if we can just pick up on this last piece of just the moment that we're in right now and what it is that philanthropy can do. We're sitting here in mid-July 2020. As Jerry said, many states don't even have budgets to the extent that they are. They're sort of fictional, sort of science fiction writing about what might happen. But they're very, very infrequently are they actual budget documents that will be adhered to. And as you said, Jerry, in Massachusetts, it's a 1/12 budget approach, and other people are doing similar things. So I guess we can sort of pick up on the idea of what are the roles that that philanthropy can play now in this moment, building off of sort of the next piece of where you all were going, and what that might look like over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months.
Yeah, so a couple things. One is this is on it from a really different angle than advocacy, which is filling. Ginna was sort of alluding to this, but like filling in where government won't or can't fill in. So, one of the things that we did 3 months ago, which we're still doing, which we've never done before in any significant way, but we had no choice, was we stood up an emergency fund for our clients. I mean, we serve almost 20,000 people a year, and many of probably more than half of our clients are immigrants to the United States. Many of them are frontline workers. Many of them lost their jobs. Many of them didn't have unemployment insurance. It took a while for that to kick in. We had a lot of people who just needed food on the table and needed to pay rent. And so we stood up an emergency fund, and frankly, like that happened entirely through philanthropy because it had to happen immediately, and it had to be flexible. I mean, we had to get money to people like that day, and government is for all of the amazing things government can do, that type of thing is not something that government can do easily or well. And philanthropy can actually. And now, interestingly, in Massachusetts, there are a couple of funds that integrate between philanthropy and government. So I think, it took a little bit of time. So to the credit of the city administration and the state administration and several large philanthropies, there's been, I think Louisa was talking about this, kind of an integration of philanthropy and government, leaning on things that philanthropy can do. So that's one thing. And then the second, I would say is, look, in the direct service world, organizations are just struggling. They're really struggling, and they will struggle more. It's going to be a very, I think this year was actually not the hardest year. I think next year is going to be harder. So I think maybe it was Ginna who said, and a lot of, I will say thank you to the many of our philanthropic partners, in fact, most, reached out to us and made program grants, general operating support, and then paid us immediately so that we actually had cash. This was huge. First of all, it was an enormous boost to morale, to myself and my colleagues, but it also meant, we didn't have to do any layoffs. And when combined with PPP and all of that, we were actually able to stay whole. And I think that's going to continue. Unfortunately, that's going to be, I believe, a problem next year. And then the last thing, and I'll stop, is advocacy is, poor and working people. It's just a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. And so, right now, Congress is, deciding whether or not expanded unemployment insurance, which runs out next week, is going to happen. It's probably the biggest impact on poverty that will happen in the next couple of months. But food stamps, unemployment insurance at the state level, the equivalents at the state level, earned income tax credit. These are all elements that are going to be hugely important over the next year. And I think there's enormous opportunity for advocacy, supporting organizing, supporting great advocacy, for advocating themselves. So lots to do.
Good. Ginna, you were about to chime in.
Yeah. And Jerry actually touched upon many of the things that I would say. I think that this immediate moment is one that demands, people are trying to keep lights on and food on the table. Folks who were here 2 weeks ago for the webinar with the Jews of Color Initiative know that we also did launched a fund for Jews of color and people of color who work in the Jewish community. We did not expect, we did expect the application to come in and the need to be so clear and present. But I think what's important and what that showed is the need for us to look at these needs through a racial equity lens, because everything that is hard now is making, for many people, particularly Black people and other people of color, harder than this situation just has already been. So it's important to realize that this moment is compounded upon challenges with housing and wages and healthcare on top of everything else. So I think it's really important for us to look at that. And when we're thinking about what it means to deliver resources to the community, looking at some of those long-term equity imbalances that compound the issues. I also think that one thing, just to add on to what Jerry was saying about, getting that sort of lifesaver funding, is how about life-saving relaxation of deadlines and demands? And let's take a look at what the grant agreement looked like. And recognizing we're in pandemic mode. Things that might have taken a month 6 months ago might take 2 months now. Everything takes a little bit longer, and recognizing that I think giving grantees and giving organizations a little bit of breathing room on some of the work that was on their plate before the pandemic and how they're doing the work and how long the work takes is really important. I think another thing that philanthropy can do, in addition to what Jerry said, and I agree 100% with everything, is, and this is tough, is looking at dupes in the system. What organizations can we consolidate within the community? Is there room for mergers and acquisitions and realizing economies of scale? Obviously that's tough, because it means it will be a tough scenario, because it means that not everyone's going to have a job at the end of said processes. And I think Jerry's right that the real rubber is going to meet the road next year. And in order for us to get ready for what that looks like next year, I think we have to start thinking about tough decisions right now, so that when we get to that point, we have a clearer analysis of who we're serving, how we're serving them, and we're being super responsible and efficient with our resources.
Yeah, and then just these last 2 points are so important. I'm not sure, I think many of you know Vu Lee, who has a website called Nonprofit AF. You can guess what AF stands for, but it's nonprofitaf.com. If you haven't seen it, please go, not right now, in 20 minutes, please go there. But really, it's sort of a speaking truth to power, and there's a lot there about what it is that philanthropists do, really unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, but very much unintentionally, to actually figure out, he says things like, does this board member spark joy? And let's look at crappy funding practices, and really just speaks in a very candid way about a number of these things. Again, and the good news, bad news is that it's not exclusive to the Jewish community. The bad news is that it's even worse, right, and more rampant elsewhere. And so it's a really important sort of self-reflective moment for everyone to kind of up their game a little bit and think about how they can do things differently. We do have one question in the chat, but before we chime in, Louisa, I want to give you a chance to enter the conversation again. And specifically, you worked on a pretty large scale, rapidly stood up COVID emergency fund. So it may be worth just mentioning that in addition to anything else you want to do, and sort of how philanthropic partnerships had to change and be different to really be helpful in this moment.
Thank you, Susan. And so I do want to echo and support everything Ginna and Jerry said about speed and nimbleness and the need to recognize how COVID has amplified systemic challenges across the board, and that in effect, issues that were already there are all the larger, and only philanthropy has the ability to rapidly move in a way to address some of these. So when Susan and I were talking about this leading up to this call, it felt like years ago. We're talking about like 8 weeks ago. But basically at the beginning of COVID, in the beginning of March, the Ford Foundation and the Bloomberg Foundations in New York City realized that there would be enormous sudden demand on nonprofits doing both cultural and human service work, and brought together coalitions, one focused on human services and one focused on cultural organizations. So UJA, by nature of its support in the human service arena, was a central part of the human service team. And what was really innovative was that a group of philanthropies, and it being New York, the scale of dollars was perhaps larger than in some regions, but $100 million was brought together really quickly. And philanthropies pooled money and jointly sat on a granting committee and pushed out money over the course of weeks in about $250,000 increments, really, really fast, trying to keep the paperwork low. It was basically unrestricted money. The requirement was that the nonprofit was doing work that had to do with COVID response. Afterwards, we really looked at the data and we looked at what the programs were, and many issues of feeding community, keeping community stably housed, supporting people in the community who would not otherwise be able to tap into supports. So for immigration reasons or other barriers, and really trying to think about how to amplify what nonprofits do best in supporting the vulnerable, and how philanthropy could take this moment to relinquish the sort of my special sauce versus your special sauce and work together to push that out. It was 8 weeks of work, and it was really fast, and the intention was an immediate response. And we've agreed as a group of philanthropies to think about as we move towards recovery, because from a public health perspective, we believed we'd have one or maybe two waves. I think what we see now it raises then the question of where really are we in this pandemic? Because this wave, as it crosses the country and waves presumably back towards us, shifts general public health notions of response and recovery. But the innovation was the speed, the working together, and the real focus on, with as few strings as possible, as Ginna has said, recognize that paperwork in a pandemic is really problematic. And you need some accountability, but try and keep it minimal and let people go out and do what they're best at, even if the out means, being on the Zoom or the telephone by nature of the distancing and the health requirements of what we're doing. I hope that helps, Susan.
No, that's great. That's terrific. And I just want to bring in one question from the chat, and I think it's for Ginna, but anyone, how do we 501c3s with our lobbying limitations really work on the leadership question? And maybe even just a little bit more broadly, I think there are a lot of myths about what you can and can't do with a 501c3 status.
Right.
Certainly, you cannot, work with a particular candidate on a particular, but the number of things that 501c3s can do and don't do
Absolutely.
is shocking. So Ginna, if you want to start there and
Yeah.
and I'll chime in.
I thank you for raising that. And I would just say at the outset, folks who are interested in a legal treatment of what 501c3s are permitted to do, what they might want to look at doing less of or more of, Boulder Advocacy at the Alliance for Justice is a tremendous resource for nonprofits who are trying to figure out how they engage in our sort of political system. And as Susan said, getting cozy with particular candidates is prohibited, but within the confines of your own budget, you are certainly permitted to lobby if you wanted, for example, on particular pieces of legislation, keeping in mind like what your budget is, there are things that folks and organizations can do. Obviously you can't spend all of your time or energy lobbying or doing the like, but you can spend a little bit, and you can also do unlimited amounts of education and relationship building and being a resource for elected officials. That is certainly something that all 501c3s can do, regardless of your appetite for risk. And so I think that that's really important. Like if you are able to be someone who has connections to elected officials or relationships, I think that's another way. You can also use back channels of being supportive. When I say grass tops influence, that means that I may say to a friend or colleague of mine who is in the leadership position at a foundation, hey, I know this state representative. Can you give them a call about this particular issue? Can you see how they're feeling about this particular piece of legislation? It doesn't actually need to be done within the confines of your official 501c3. Sometimes individual people, just regular old folks, not with your foundation or your philanthropy attached, can be really important in getting legislation moved, policy advanced, and really and lives changed. So I would think expansively about what leadership means and about what and how you can leverage your own relationships, whether they're personal, they're professional, they're with the foundation or the philanthropy. I think there's many ways that can be brought to bear on making systemic change at multiple levels.
Susan, can I just add to this? So first of all, I'm a registered lobbyist, and I'm the president and CEO of a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And I do spend time at the State House. But more to the point, we actually have two lobbyists that we contract with. One that we contract with and pay for both federal and state work. And then our Jewish Community Relations Council is our lobbyist. And I will tell you that had it not been our strategy about scaling our work and actually combining that with advocacy for immediately following the last presidential election, our advocacy for immigrants and refugees, that was both about policy change and resources, so it was both things at the same time, would not have been possible without the JCRC and the years of relationship building that they have done with the key leadership in Massachusetts. I'm talking about the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. These are folks that have been on, to events. They've been on study tours to Israel. This work has been going on for years. And so when I go to the State House, it's not the fact that I'm a lobbyist that matters. It's the fact that these relationships have been built and they make a huge difference, both in financial resources and in policy changes, both, all.
Great. It's funny because I was reminded that a couple of years ago, I co-authored an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called "When Philanthropy Meets Advocacy." And you work on these articles for a long time, and there was a little chart in there which, for whatever reason, got the majority of the attention, and it was advocacy activities that 501c3s organizations can legally engage in. And it was sort of a whole list of things. And it was everything, Ginna, as you were saying, from conduct research and really shaping the debate by surfacing new insights or messaging and focus groups, and really thinking about how to, in a nonpartisan, independent way, really sort of shape the message. And people like Urban Institute and American Enterprise Institute, AEI, I mean, people on all sides of the spectrum do this really effectively. They can develop model policy legislation. They can develop draft administrative rules. They can litigate. They can, fund social movements and fund groups of parents or residents or whomever it is who don't have a voice to kind of get a voice in the direct voice in the process. And as we've said, there are some limitations on lobbying and mobilizing the base around particular legislative issues and electoral politics. But even there is if you hire a good attorney, they will tell you that your each election and specific percentages that you need to pay attention to. But the degrees of freedom when people really start to ask that question in a serious way, I think we've sort of moved well past the point of people saying, is it advocacy important? I mean, we don't do advocacy anymore. I'm kind of not hearing that as much as we heard in the past. We're not hearing, well, that's, we don't want to get political. I think people are seeing that all these issues, to the extent that you care about them, are at least to some extent political. So understanding those rules of engagement, understanding, the power maps, as you said, just who knows who and can make, create conversations, create meetings, and sort of where the opportunities are given the trillions of dollars flowing through bills right now, figuring out what do those need to look like to really kind of move real different flows of money, change the direction of the chutes as the money flows through. So at any rate, yes, there really are a number of those places. So it's, I would say if you're interested in that, don't use it as an excuse. Call someone on this panel or a good attorney, and they will be able to help you find your way through on that. So we have about 7 minutes left. I wanted to give each of you a chance to kind of either ask each other a question or sort of raise sort of a final sort of idea. And then I'd love to kind of go around and just get sort of a headline from each of you as to sort of, as you think about this, what would you kind of take away as the most important message for folks? So Louisa, can we start with you and then we'll go back around?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to add one thing to the lobbying. I'm also a registered lobbyist. I'm a proud swamp dweller, as I say. And I think it's important to separate politics from policy. Our mission is to help the vulnerable, and we focus on that. We're agnostic as to who's elected, but we recognize that some elected officials are more supportive of policies that we wish to push forward than others. And so, and I know from being on the inside government side, you need people to explain to you the consequences, whether they be anecdotal or at scale, of what's going on. And so, both sides need that. And education, be it, individual stories or site visits or, really having people understand how the choices, elected people and government leaders, the choices they are making are impacting the communities they care about is so important. And in some ways, education is like at the forefront of shifting people's opinions. So I really, really strongly agree there. So I wanted to ask about the direct service systemic network and the gaps. And if we think about, here we are in COVID, sort of amplifying challenges of poverty, long existing issues of poverty, but amplified all the more because of lack of access to healthcare and other underlying gaps, and multitude of policies coming together and perhaps highlighted through the now weeks of attention to Black Lives Matter and thinking really about what is the role of race and systemic racism within our social service policies, I'm interested to think about how that area, how what we can do as philanthropy or in the world of Jewish philanthropy to think, where could we be in a year, or where could we be in 18 months as we hopefully are looking at the wind down of COVID and looking at, moving beyond the pandemic era and really thinking, what else should we be thinking about? And so that's my question to my fellow panelists, to think, what do you guys see as the priorities so that when we emerge, we're in a better place and we aren't looking at or is there an opportunity to shift more?
Good. That's a powerful question to leave us on. Jerry, do you want to go next? And then Ginna, I'll give you the last word. We have about 4 more minutes.
On this question that Louisa just raised, and it's about kind of the intersection of policy change and direct service, which I think about a lot, because I actually think they're inextricably linked. A lot of times people tend to separate them, but we've actually been growing our public policy and advocacy work because I just know that we can't solve these problems one student at a time. It's just not possible. So one issue around class inequity and one around race inequity that I've been thinking about. So we are involved in a coalition that very successfully in Massachusetts advocated for an increase in the minimum wage. And Massachusetts is now climbing to the up to $15 an hour. We'll be there next year. Well, we're all about economic success. Our theory of change is give people skills, get them better jobs, they'll earn more, they'll be able to sustain a family. But we know that's not the only solution. And the way we know this is because we collect data on earnings. And as soon as the minimum wage goes up, we see the data goes up on people's earnings. And it's not because of what they learned in our class. It's because the law that says what the minimum wage has to be got changed. So these are incredibly powerful. So relative to racial inequities, I've been thinking a lot about this for what might be an important piece of work this year. In Massachusetts, it would seem to me it's around criminal justice reform, or one really important area in Massachusetts called CORI. But basically prior criminal records eliminate the largest employment sectors in Boston from many individuals from participating. The healthcare industry, for example, which is the largest employment sector, does not, and in some ways cannot, and in some ways does not hire individuals with prior criminal records. And so this is a huge intersection between what public policy's impact on the labor market is and what our work as a workforce development organization is, and how it intersects with racial justice and economic justice at the same level. So I just think that it's making that connection. It's not an either or, it's a both and in my mind.
Good. Ginna, we'll give you the last word. Try to summarize this incredibly wide-ranging conversation in less than 90 seconds. But just what's kind of, as you think about sort of the headlines from this, what's on your mind right now?
Yeah. First, thanks, Louisa and Jerry, because I think we have managed to share so much depth and breadth about exactly what is at play here and at stake. And the only thing that I would add is just this notion that the systemic racism that undergirds our systems of employment, of healthcare, of housing and education, all of these things, basically Americana, are important for us as a Jewish community to look at internally and externally. And so what that means is, as we look to and serve our full, diverse Jewish community, how are the people in our own community experiencing those intersections and experiencing those oppressions and experiencing that inequity in their outside life as just Americans getting jobs and finding apartments and putting their kids in school, but also in our own Jewish community? How are they able to show up and be and present and participate in an environment such as that? So I would push us to think about that internal Jewish community, and also as a Jewish community, what are we doing? And we've all talked about this. What are we doing on the advocacy piece, on the policy piece, on actually disrupting the systems that have perpetuated these challenges? And so that's what I would leave everyone with today. It's a lot to think on, a lot to think about. And to be honest, you know, Susan, you asked about the next 6 months or the 18 months. I feel like it's one day at a time. Right now, there is so much uncertainty in the world, and I certainly feel like you can't build toward a future if you can't see it. Right now, I feel like there's a lot in our way, and it's a lot to ask for us to try right now, because there's just a lot in the world going on. So give yourselves a break too, as you're thinking about what these next 6, 12, or 18 months are going to look like.
So true, especially as we all think about the personal lives that we're leading. Everyone is living with at least, you know, a very difficult degree of uncertainty, regardless of how existential that feels at the moment. And so sort of wise advice and things that we thought were true 12 weeks ago don't seem to be true anymore. And that may be true 12 weeks from now. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to each of the 3 of you. We're at the top of the hour. And just on that last point, if you haven't watched the Jews of Color sort of representation webinar from a couple weeks ago, Ginna participated in, and Alana Kaufman helped lead, and Angel. I think it's just important for everyone to kind of think through that piece of it and the representation piece as we think about the intersectionality of all of these issues in the sectors. But for now, I just want to say thank you to the 3 of you. And you know, Tamar, do you want to sort of give us the outro with our next webinar?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louisa and Jerry and Ginna, and for Susan for masterfully facilitating so much information, such a complicated issue, and being able to bring it down to a level for people like me and to understand is very much appreciated. So thank you. Yes, we have some interesting things coming up. I wanted to make sure everybody knows about in 2 weeks from now, August 4th, from 12 to 1 Eastern time, so same time on Tuesday, August 4th, we're going to have another briefing talking and focusing on higher education, access to higher education, and enabling people to be successful and persist when they're there. I also wanted to let everybody know that today the monthly newsletter for the Affinity Group went out. I'm going to put it in the chat for those of you that are with us live. I'll also tell you, because for those of you listening, it's jfunders.org/National Affinity Group on Jewish Poverty. We have a monthly newsletter and lots of interesting information, articles from people in the field, and information about upcoming events. And with that, I will say thank you again for all of the panelists and for everybody that participated, and look forward to seeing you soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.